Welcome to the Crawcast. I'm your host, George Krawczak, and this is what happened in Week 12 of the NFL season. If you like this type of content, make sure to hit that subscribe button like it owes you money. The first game was the Cleveland Browns versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Browns won 24-19. The Browns' leading passer is Jameis Winston, who had 219 yards and an interception. Their leading rusher is Nick Chubb, who had 59 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading receiver is Jerry Jeudy, who had 85 receiving yards. And for the Steelers, the leading passer was Russell Wilson, who had 270 passing yards and a touchdown. Their leading rusher is Jaylen Warren, who had 45 rushing yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver is Calvin Austin, who had 78 receiving yards and a touchdown. So for this game, the Browns looked pretty decent. Neither team looked that great on offense, but the Browns, Myles Garrett just completely took over the game, it felt like. He shut down Russell Wilson. He played really good and was just a game wrecker the entire time. Russell Wilson, he didn't play terrible, but overall, he just needed to kind of get the ball out more, and he struggled a little bit of accuracy. And then also, it was good to see Nick Chubb getting 2 touchdowns. I feel bad for him because he was having such a good career until he got injured, and he clearly just isn't himself anymore. And I don't know if he's going to figure it out or if he's just done because of his horrible knee injury, but just feel bad for him just because he was having such a promising career and he clearly just isn't himself. And it's just going to be interesting how it works because the Steelers, they needed to win this and they needed to take care of business and they just couldn't. And they are still probably going to they are still going to make the playoffs, but you just got to the wins are hard to come by and you just got to have them. And so it's going to be interesting how the season ends for the Steelers and then Browns. Maybe they can build momentum towards next season. That's what happened with the Lions a couple of years ago, where they built momentum, won a lot of games at the end of the year, and that's how they brought it into the following year uh, greatly. The next game is the Detroit Lions versus the Indianapolis Colts. The Lions won 24-6. The Lions' leading passer is Jared Goff, who had 269 passing yards. Their leading rusher is Jahmyr Gibbs, who had 90 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. And their leading receiver is Jameson Williams, who had 64 receiving yards. And for the Colts, their leading passer is Anthony Richardson, who had 172 passing yards. Their leading rusher is Anthony Richardson, who had 61 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is Michael Pittman, who had 96 receiving yards. So for this game, the Lions offense continued to look really, really good and really be the great offense that they've been all season. I think they probably are the best offense in the NFL, but their big issue is their defense. The Colts really had a lot of major penalties, and that kind of cost them the game. Like, they've had a lot of 30, 40-yard bombs and just penalties overturned every single one of them. Honestly, if there weren't that many penalties on the Colts, I truly think that this could have been a very close one, and the Colts might have even won it, just of how bad penalties affected their team. And then overall, with the Colts, Anthony Richardson, he played fine. It's just that the Lions' defense concerns me a lot. They're picking on Kendall Vildor, especially since Terrion Arnold wasn't playing, and then when Carlton Davis went out, it really felt like the Lions' corners did not play well. And they just kind of got bailed out by penalties and bad plays by the Colts offense. And so, is the Lions' defense good enough to win in the playoffs? And that's the question, because last year their defense wasn't very good either. But their offense did carry their defense to the NFC Championship, and then eventually they blew it in the NFC Championship game. So that'll be interesting how the Lions season goes. And if Carlton Davis has to miss a lot, I don't know. It just seemed like a shoulder injury. Like, it wasn't too bad. He did walk off the field on his own. But if Carlton Davis has to miss some time, that's going to be very nerve-wracking for the Lions. And who knows how that's going to go for the rest of them. But overall, for the Lions, you got to be very happy with the result of this. The next game is the Kansas City Chiefs versus the Carolina Panthers. The Chiefs won 30-27. The Chiefs' leading passer is Patrick Mahomes, who had 269 yards and 3 touchdowns. Their leading rusher is Kareem Hunt, who had 68 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is Noah Gray, who had 66 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. And for the Panthers, their leading passer was Bryce Young, who had 263 yards and a touchdown. Their leading rusher is Chuba Hubbard, who had 58 rushing yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver, was David Moore, who had 81 receiving yards and a touchdown. So for this game, this is really the first game the Chiefs' offense looked really good. The problem is, on the flip side, is their defense looked really horrible. And This really gives me cause for concern because you have to look at the Lions last week. The Lions, they were going against a bad team, and so they beat the bad team 53-6. And now the Chiefs, they're going against a bad team, and they barely win 30-27. This gives me major cause for concern because throughout the whole year, it's been the Chiefs' offense playing bad and the defense kind of bailing them out. Whereas this one, the Chiefs' defense played horrible and the offense bailed them out. When it comes to the playoffs and when you're against these super hot, super great teams, can you put a full, complete game together? And this one does make me a little nervous saying, can the Chiefs do it? I don't know. I honestly probably not. And then the Panthers, you got to be happy with this. Bryce Young looked really good. He was making great checks at the line. He just played great. And you got to be happy with this because Bryce Young was looking horrible, and I was like, do they move off of their first overall quarterback after 1 year, which I still think is way too early to move off their quarterback, but there's talk on that. And now I think he's shown that he's at least potentially capable of being your franchise quarterback for the future. So the Chiefs, you just got to be nervous even though you got the win. And then this is a good moral victory for the Panthers, is that even though they lost, they at least were in it throughout the whole game, and they nearly beat one of the best teams in the NFL, being one of the worst teams, because the Panthers' defense feels non-existent. It is absolutely horrible. So overall, that's more cause for concern for the Chiefs and just a great game for the Panthers. The next game is the Minnesota Vikings versus the Chicago Bears. The Vikings won 30-27. The Vikings' leading passer was Sam Darnold, who had 330 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Aaron Jones, who had 106 yards and a touchdown. Their leading receiver is Jordan Addison, who had 162 yards and a touchdown. And then for the Bears, their leading passer is Caleb Williams, who had 340 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher is Caleb Williams, who had 33 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is DJ Moore, who had 106 rushing yards and a touchdown. So for this game, both teams actually looked pretty good. Both offenses were humming. Both defenses struggled quite a bit. Just the Bears, man. I can't remember who they hired as their new, or who they got as their new offensive coordinator. But honestly, I'm thinking about that he should be in head coach consideration because the the Bears defense was decent, and then all of a sudden their offense was horrible. They fired their offensive coordinator, and now Caleb Williams is looking like an actual franchise quarterback, and he's looking really good. And that's got to give you a lot of promise for the Bears. And then even though both defenses struggled, like the Bears really should have won this, and they really seem to be on the up and up. They probably should have beat the Packers last year if it wasn't for a blocked field goal. They went to overtime for the Vikings, and they probably should have won this game too. And it's the Bears are just looking really good and have been improving, especially of how horrible they looked before. And the Vikings, you gotta be happy with this. You're 9-2, which is an insane record, and it's just unfortunate you're in a division of the Packers at 8-3, and then the Lions at 10-1, but just the Vikings, they keep on winning. They're going to make the playoffs, and it's going to be very interesting because their defense has, even though they didn't play well this game, it has been playing well overall, and then their offense is really good. It's just tough because the NFC is such a great conference that it feels like in almost any other conference, the Bears or the Vikings would be the top team, or the Packers would be the top team, and then now it's just because the Packers, Vikings, and Lions are all together. It's going to be very interesting how the season finishes. The next game is the Tennessee Titans versus Houston Texans. The Titans won 32-27. The Titans' leading passer was Will Levis, who threw for 278 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception. Their leading rusher was Tony Pollard, who had 119 rushing yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver was Calvin Ridley, who had 93 receiving yards. And for the Texans, their leading passer was C.J. Stroud, who had 247 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. Their leading rusher was Joe Mixon, who had 22 rushing yards, and then their leading receiver is Nico Collins, who had 92 receiving yards and a touchdown. So for this game, it kind of seems like these two teams on the reverse. The Titans seem to be playing better. Will Levis has been playing a lot better, and honestly, I think Will Levis has earned the opportunity to at least get another year for a shot of being the Titans franchise quarterback. He did throw a bad interception, that bad pick six, but other than that, he played really good this game. And I think he's definitely shown enough good to earn a shot at becoming the Titans quarterback and not just being kind of thrown away and drafted as another. And then CJ Stroud, he's just been struggling a lot. The O-line struggling, the whole team struggling, but especially CJ Stroud. He had that horrible end to the game where he basically did Dan Orlovsky and ran into the back of the end zone. Can't have that. And then just has not played well the last several weeks. And I think partly because teams are starting to figure him out after seeing him in, week one. But also part of that is just he just hasn't been playing good because I think it is a little bit misleading in the sense that in the first game or in his first year he was good, but good for a rookie, not necessarily great for an actual NFL quarterback. Like if you put any other quarterback like Patrick Mahomes and or Aaron Rodgers or somebody like that or Josh Allen and said this is or put their name on CJ Stroud's play, you'd be like, ooh, that's not too good. But since it was a rookie, CJ Stroud was much overhyped. But we'll see if he can turn it around. But just overall, the Texans just feel like a mess right now, and there's no real good solutions. The next game is the Miami Dolphins versus the New England Patriots. The Dolphins won 34-15. The Dolphins' leading passer was Tua, who had 317 yards and 4 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Devon Achane, who had 32 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Jalen Waddle, who had 144 receiving yards and a touchdown. And then for the Patriots, their leading passer is Drake May, who had 222 passing yards and 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Their leading rusher was Antonio Gibson, who had 31 rushing yards. And then their leading receiver was Demario Douglas, who had 62 receiving yards. So for this game, it is going to be interesting if the Dolphins can make the playoffs, because theoretically they need to be about 4-2 in the remaining games, and that's just going to be very tough for them if they can do it or not. And it just kind of sucks for them, because it is showing they are a good team. It's just that Tua got injured and they lost all those games, and it just feels like it might be too big of a hole for them to dig out of. And it just sucks to see because it really feels like they could be one of the top teams if he never got injured. And then the Patriots, you got to be happy with this. Drake May still looks good. And the reason why I say Drake May looks good is because I feel like you need to put him on a different standard than a lot of other quarterbacks because he is definitely in the worst situation in the NFL. One of the worst O-lines, doesn't have a wide receiver number 1, doesn't have a run game. Just everything is going wrong and horrible for the Patriots, and Drake May is looking decent. And it's actually good that they're losing because that's going to give them a better draft pick. And I understand that they can't go full rebuild year one because kind of like what the Texans saw is like, hey, CJ Stroud looked pretty good, so we feel like we can win a Super Bowl in year 2. Drake May's looking like that where he's pretty good, but there's just so many issues with the Patriots. There's no solving it in year 2. But overall, I think both teams are happy with the result, and it's going to be very interesting if the Dolphins can get a shot at the playoffs. The next game is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers versus the New York Giants. The Buccaneers won 30-7. The Buccaneers' leading passer is Baker Mayfield, who had 294 yards. Their leading rusher is Bucky Irvin, who had 87 rushing yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver is Mike Evans. Mike Evans, who had 68 receiving yards. And for the Giants, their leading passer is Tommy DeVito, who had 189 passing yards. Their leading rusher is Tyrone Tracy Jr., who had 42 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is Malik Nabers, who had 64 receiving yards. So for this game, it's just kind of the Buccaneers are a good team, and they beat up on the Giants, who are terrible. The Buccaneers looked fairly decent. Baker Mayfield looked good. Just everyone in the Buccaneers just kind of did their job and did what they were supposed to do, was beat up on a bad team. And then the Giants, Tommy DeVito is clearly not the answer. I think I'm interested if they're just going for full-on tanking or not. Because if they're fully planning on tanking, just start Tommy DeVito for the rest of the year. There's no point onto not starting him for the rest of the year. But if you actually want to win and maybe find a franchise quarterback, I would give Drew Lock an opportunity. Because when he was with Denver, even though overall he wasn't great, he did have flashes and a couple of really good games that showed he could potentially be a franchise quarterback in the NFL. And I think you got at least hope to get some of those flashes again if you're the Giants. But if you're just interested in tanking and don't really want to win any games, then start Tommy DeVito. Because Tommy DeVito really... He had that one decent game against the Packers, and then other than that, he hasn't shown anything on why he should be an NFL quarterback. The next game is the Dallas Cowboys versus the Washington Commanders. The Cowboys won 34-26. The Cowboys' leading passer is Cooper Rush, who had 247 yards, 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher is Rico Dowdle, who had 86 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is CeeDee Lamb, who had 67 receiving yards. And then for the Commanders, their leading passer is Jaden Daniels, who had 275 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. The leading rusher is Jaden Daniels, who had 74 rushing yards and a touchdown. And then their leading receiver is Terry McLaurin, who had 102 receiving yards and a touchdown. So for this game, the Cowboys actually looked really good. And honestly, the Commanders' defense just overall fell apart. The Commanders' defense basically couldn't stop the run, couldn't stop the pass. Rico Dowdle had his first decent game. Cooper Rush had played pretty decent. He played pretty decent last week. Overall, he wasn't great. And then Jaden Daniels really didn't play that great. They had the amazing Terry McLaurin play to effectively end the game and almost tie it. And then their kicker missed the extra point. And just overall, the Cowboys looked really good. It doesn't really matter because they're going to be out of the playoffs, but Cooper Rush looked great. And then the Commanders is this cause for some concern because Jaden Daniels really hasn't played great the last couple of weeks. And maybe they're just kind of falling back down to earth after playing pretty well and really playing over expectations. And so there's got to be a lot of cause for concern for the Commanders. They're not really in any concern of making the playoffs. I think they probably will, and there's, it's just tough because it's the NFC, but I think they'll probably make the playoffs. And it's just that the Cowboys look good, and it's going to be interesting how these two seasons go. The next game is the Denver Broncos versus the Las Vegas Raiders. The Broncos won 29-19. The Broncos' leading passer is Bo Nix, who threw for 273 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Jaleel McLaughlin, who had 44 rushing yards, and their leading receiver was Courtland Sutton, who had 97 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. And for the Raiders, their leading passer is Gardner Minshew, who had 230 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Their leading rusher was Sincere McCormick, who had 33 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Jacoby Myers, who had 121 receiving yards. So for this game, kind of generic thing that I've been saying all week is a good team beat a bad team. The Broncos look really good. Bo Nix has looked great. I think he really deserves some more Offensive Rookie of the Year consideration. At least it shouldn't be Jaden Daniels running away. You should at least look at it more fairly in the sense that it's a much closer competition than a lot of people think. Courtland Sutton's looked really, really great. And then for the Raiders, they're just continuing to struggle. Minshew looked okay, and then he broke his collarbone and is going to be out for the year. Desmond Ridder really isn't good. They had no run game. Their offensive line has been terrible, and that's honestly been the Raiders' season all year, is that they've had no run game, and their offensive line has been terrible, and who knows if they can really pick that up or not. But the Broncos are really good. I think they can probably sneak into the playoffs, and who knows what's going to happen then. And their defense is definitely overperforming expectations and playing great. The next game is the Green Bay Packers versus San Francisco 49ers. The Packers won 38-10. The Packers' leading passer was Jordan Love, who had 163 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Josh Jacobs, who had 106 yards and 3 touchdowns. And their leading receiver is Romeo Doubs, who had 54 receiving yards. And for the 49ers, their leading passer was Brandon Allen, who had 199 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Their leading rusher was Christian McCaffrey, who had 31 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is George Kittle, who had 82 receiving yards and a touchdown. So for this game, the Packers looked really good. They kind of needed this as a get-right game. Last week, they barely lost to Chicago, and the Packers looked horrible. Or they barely beat Chicago. And even though they won the game, they looked horrible last week. And so they needed a get-right game to just look great. Their defensive game plan was perfect in the sense they're like, okay, we're going to stop the run game, load the box up, and if Brandon Allen somehow beats us with his arm, we'll let him. And so, even though the 49ers were beaten up and injured, you do need to get credit for beating up a bad and injured team instead of making it close like the Chiefs and Panthers. And so the Packers looked really good in this game. They kind of shut down the 49ers all over the field. Deebo Samuel had a horrible drop. And then the 49ers, it's going to be tough. Like Brock Purdy, who knows if he's going to be able to play next week. And if they have any hope to make the playoffs, they need to just get healthy of Nick Bosa, Brock Purdy, and just overall, the 49ers are injured, and the Packers just looked really good. And again, every team needs a get-right game, a game where you just dominate and blow out your opponent, and that was this for the Packers. They looked really good in the red zone, and their defense just looked really great, committing a lot of turnovers. Xavier McKinney looked good. Keyshawn Nixon had a huge forced fumble, and just overall, the Packers had a really, really great game. and every single win matters, especially on a great NFC where, the Commanders are at 7 wins in the wild card. The Packers are at 8 wins in the wild card. And the Vikings are at 9 wins in the wild card. And typically you need to get to 9 wins to make the wild card. So it's going to be very interesting how this race ends. And the Packers are just looking really good, even though their offense struggled a bit. The next game is the Seattle Seahawks versus the Arizona Cardinals. The Seahawks won 16-6. The Seahawks leading passer is Geno Smith, who had 254 passing yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. The Seahawks leading rusher was Kenneth Walker, who had 41 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is Jackson Smith-Njigba, who had 77 receiving yards and a touchdown. And for the Cardinals, their leading passer was Kyler Murray, who had 285 yards and an interception. Their leading rusher was Trey Benson, who had 18 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is Trey McBride, who had 113 receiving yards. So for this game, both defenses played really well and both offenses struggled quite a bit. The Seahawks basically got a pick six, and that's what won them the game. It's just unfortunate how both teams' offenses really struggled a lot, and it was pretty shocking because the Seahawks defense has not been good this year, and the Cardinals offense has been good in spurts in the sense that there's a few games like against the Packers where they struggled, but overall the Cardinals offense has been pretty decent, and it's just hard to explain what happened. Both offenses crumbled and didn't play well, and overall just it's very concerning, and it seems like whoever wins the NFC West is just going to get out in the first wild card round. And just both the teams are bad, but they're both in divisional contention because every team is within 1 win of each other in the NFC West. So that's going to be interesting how that finishes. The next game is the Philadelphia Eagles versus the LA Rams. The Eagles won 37-20. The Eagles' leading passer is Jalen Hurts, who had 179 yards and a touchdown. Their leading rusher is Saquon Barkley, who had 255 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading receiver was A.J. Brown, who had 6 receptions for 109 yards and a touchdown. And for the Rams, their leading passer was Matthew Stafford, who had 243 passing yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Kyren Williams, who had 72 rushing yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver was Puka Nacua, who had 117 receiving yards. So for this game, both teams actually looked pretty good, and it was a pretty decent game until Saquon Barkley basically just tore it away and won it for the Eagles. Both teams looked fairly solid, except for the Rams' defense completely fell apart towards the end, and just overall, this Eagles team looks pretty decent. I see people saying Saquon Barkley deserves to be an MVP conversation, and I agree and I don't agree. I agree he does, but I just don't think it's going to happen. I even made a video on this on who should have won MVP last year. You can check that out, where I thought Christian McCaffrey deserved to be MVP because no real quarterback had that great of a season. And even with Lamar winning it, I still think it should have gone to Dak Prescott or Josh Allen, because Josh Allen was probably the best quarterback, even though he had a lot of turnovers. And if you can't justify the turnovers, then give it to Dak Prescott. But no real quarterback had that great of a season last year, and it should have gone to McCaffrey, and McCaffrey didn't win it. So I just don't think Saquon Barkley has any shot at winning it. But overall, Saquon Barkley and this Eagles team is just looking really good. And it's going to be very interesting for the Lions and Eagles which one prevails. I think you still got to give it to the Lions because they are a better overall team than the Eagles. But man, that's going to be interesting NFC how it works out. The final game of the week is the Baltimore Ravens versus the LA Chargers. The Ravens won 30-23. The Ravens' leading passer was Lamar Jackson, who threw for 177 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Derrick Henry, who had 140 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is Zay Flowers, who had 62 receiving yards. And for the Chargers, their leading passer is Justin Herbert, who had 218 yards. Their leading rusher was J.K. Dobbins, who had 40 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Ladd McConkey, who had 83 receiving yards. So for this game, it was a tough defensive battle, and it was pretty close to the majority of this game. And then towards the end of it, the Ravens just kind of snuck away and got into the end zone. Quentin Johnson had a lot of really bad drops, and this is tough because I do think the Chargers are outperforming expectations, because this was year 1 of the rebuild. They got rid of all their wide receivers, and they're basically like, hey, we're going to rebuild. And then they've exceeded expectations and played really great. But overall, if their receiving core with effectively just Ladd McConkey and nobody else, you're not going to win many games. And then the Ravens, they played pretty good, even though they weren't perfect and they did struggle quite a bit. Their offense overall came in when it mattered most, and Derrick Henry is such a beast that I think he also deserves some MVP conversations. But overall, it's going to be a very interesting season how this plays out. Kind of not much change this week in the sense that the good teams beat the bad teams, and that was a majority of what happened this week. So let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you like this type of content, make sure to hit that subscribe button like it owes you money, and I'll see you on the next one.